We are grateful to our friends at Northshire Books and Monroe Street Books for their underwriting of this program. Northshire Books has outlets in Manchester, Vermont, and Saratoga Springs, and Monroe Street Books is on Route 7 just north of Middlebury. Both are wonderful independent bookstores, and we thank them. Hello, I'm Louis Meyers, and this is Meet the Author, where we're so pleased to have with us today by Zoom from his home, Mark Kennedy Shriver. We're going to be talking about Mark's parents in particular his father, Sargent Shriver, who was really one of the most significant political and public figures of the 20th century. Mark has staked out a wonderful career of his own. He is the director of the Save the Action political network, which advocates for children throughout the United States and around the world, and I'll ask him to talk a little bit more about that organization. He also ran for elective office in 1994. He was elected to the Maryland House of Delegates, re-elected in 1998, and then in 2002 ran for Congress in Montgomery County, Maryland, losing a very close race to Chris Holland, who is now a United States Senator. His parents were Eunice and Sargent Shriver. His uncles are President Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Senator Edward Kennedy. Mark lives in Montgomery County with his wife and 3 children. It's wonderful to meet you here. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here. Thank you, Louis.
Let's start by talking about your work right now before we move on to your father's. Tell us a little bit about Save the Children Action Network and what you do there.
So Save the Children Action Network is a 501c4, which allows it to engage in political activities as well as advocacy work. I worked for Save the Children for some 20 years, and we started this organization 12 years ago in order to give kids a voice in the political process. You know, poor kids in particular, obviously they don't vote and they don't give big campaign contributions. So for many, many years, I was running around the country dealing with both federal and state elected officials, local officials, and everybody would say, Louis, how important children are. But when push came to shove, we don't put our money where our mouth is, and we don't invest as a country to the degree that we should for the needs of young children. So Save the Children Action Network was an attempt to try to mobilize Americans across the country to get involved, to advocate for local, state, and federal legislation and budget priorities, to invest in early childhood education, and also participate in elections, supporting both Republicans and Democrats who are supporting kids.
I mean,
it's a pretty basic idea. You know, you have the NRA, you have the children, you have or Sierra Club, you have AIPAC on the Jewish issue. You don't have that type of organization for young children, especially young children who are poor. So that's what Save the Children Action Network is all about.
We're in a difficult period, as you obviously know, in terms of social services. There have been many cutbacks recently in terms of the funding for SNAP and other such services. How do you take on a time like this when there's so much upheaval?
I think you engage. You know, Teddy Roosevelt's got that great quote about the credit belongs to the person who's in the arena, who gets beaten up and bloodied and knocked around, dirtied. And I think you got to, politics and democracy is a contact sport. It's never perfect. And you've got to make, defend at some points and move more aggressively at other points in time. And I think now it's critically important if you believe that as a country, we should be investing in young people, working for those on the margins, families that are struggling, the old and the young. Now is the time to get engaged. You can sit around and wring your hands and complain, or you can get in the arena and try to make a difference. So that's what Save the Children Action Network is trying to do, working with both Republicans and Democrats to try to make a difference for kids across this country and really around the world. People want to say, oh, there's nothing you can do, and that's complete hogwash. There's plenty you can do. but you got to get in the arena. You got to try. You got to call your friends. You got to call your local officials and your federal officials too, and tell them what you think. I think it's a great opportunity to make the country a little bit better. It's tough, but it's always tough.
You know, as you speak, these were the hallmarks of your father's life and career, and your mother as well. There are 3 books that are particularly helpful. One is a book that your father himself wrote called We Called It a War, about his involvement with the poverty program. There's a terrific biography, which I'm sure you probably read, by Scott Stossel, Sarge, The Life and Times of Sargent Shriver, one of the best biographies I've ever read. And then there's your book, A Good Man, which you wrote toward the end of your father's life when you were helping care for him as he struggled with Alzheimer's, but reflecting on all that he had accomplished and just who he was as a person, which is absolutely a lovely book. So I recommend all 3 books. I want to, when I talk to people, when I was telling people that I was going to be talking with you, what is remarkable is that most people under the age of 50, unless they've majored in American history or politics, and even many people under the age of 60, don't know who Sargent Shriver was. And that's unfortunate because, as I said, I think he was one of the most impactful people in certainly the second half of the 20th century. I want to take a moment to go through parts of his life, and I'll stop and ask you questions as we go along. But I think it gives a feeling for the scope. He grew up in Maryland, a Catholic family that had gone back generations in Maryland. He had relatives, in fact, a grandfather who had fought on the Confederate side, or not fought. At 17, he was Jeb Stuart's aide. And then there were others in the family who had been the Union side, which reflected the fact that Maryland was a border state. One of the interesting things in reading the biography is that as a young child, your father, these families would gather at night certainly before social media and television, even before radio, I think. They would gather on the porch and they would just discuss things. And one wonders if maybe that wasn't the seed, because your father was known for bringing people together and having conversations that didn't really spark a lot of animosity. In fact, brought people together. The family, as I read it, was genteel but not wealthy. This was during the Depression, but they managed to send your father to Catholic parochial schools and to the Canterbury School, where one of his classmates was a young and very sickly kid named John F. Kennedy. Obviously, their lives would cross. Your father, as a teenager, went overseas in something called the Experiment in International Living, where he lived with a family. I think it was in Germany in the mid to late 30s. Saw the rise of Hitler and Nazi Germany. Also, this may have been a seed, perhaps, for the future Peace Corps, because he saw what cross-cultural talks and living could do for people. He came back and attended Yale, where, interestingly, again, as I read the book, that was all male at the time, and really a school for wealthy people, even more so than today. Your father wasn't particularly wealthy, so he had to struggle a little bit, but did well as a student, went on to Yale Law School, and did well there. As he finished Yale Law School, he was wondering what he wanted to do. He wasn't totally taken by the law at that point, a little bit restless. And then Pearl Harbor occurred, and your father, who had been in the Naval Reserve, was given a commission. Similar to John F. Kennedy, he was initially assigned to military intelligence. Similar to Kennedy, he wanted to be more where the action was, and they both ended up in the Pacific. Of course, Kennedy on a PT boat, and your father on the USS South Dakota, which is a huge battleship. Your father was an ensign and then ultimately a first lieutenant in charge of an artillery battery. When you read the book, Stossel's book, about the description of what it was like on that ship, it was horrific. Your father was terrific at what he did. He was extraordinarily brave. And they won that. This was off the Guadalcanal, and the Japanese threw everything they had at them, at the Navy. But ultimately, the U.S. won that battle, but at great cost. your father lost some very close friends, some of whom were literally standing right next to him. And I did want to stop and ask you, we know a lot of men from that generation in World War II came back and didn't really talk about the war for many years. We didn't really know what PTSD was then. But I'm wondering if your father ever talked to you and your siblings about his experience in the war and how it affected him.
I mean, he definitely did, because he wrote us letters about it, and he talked oftentimes about being a warrior in battle, as well as then a warrior later in his life for peace. The only edit I would make to that very kind overview you gave is that his family, the crash in '29, and he went to high school, college, and law school all on scholarships. So the family lost what money they had in the bank run of '29, and he had to work himself again through high school, college, and law school, and then didn't go to law school graduation at Yale because he enrolled in the Navy and went to fight in the war. And yes, he definitely talked about it. He talked about it in letters that I put in the book and that Stossel has in his book on Dad, and it definitely had an impact on him. And I think that's one of the reasons that he was so enamored with the Peace Corps when he started it under President Kennedy in 1960, was because he saw the power of everlasting peace, or peace that could make a big difference, as compared to peace that came about as a result of war. And, again, time and time again, over the course of history, you see that those peace treaties don't last. But the Peace Corps is real human interaction and human peace. I think that's why he loved it so much.
He comes back from the war. He's a war hero. He's a law graduate, still a bit restless. And at that point, I believe at one point he was a junior editor for Newsweek magazine, but he meets your mother, Eunice Kennedy, at that point, who is extraordinarily intelligent, energetic, some would say fiery person. And they begin what was a 7-year courtship. And in meeting your mother, he also meets your grandfather, Joseph Kennedy Sr., who is one of the wealthiest people in America at that point, and obviously a very, very hard-driving businessman, very savvy businessman. Joe Kennedy has bought the Merchandise Mart, which is, I think, probably at the time the largest commercial building in the United States. It was in Chicago. And he sees something in your father, some kind of energy, some kind of intelligence, maybe something of himself at an early age. And he sends him out to Chicago to sort of help manage this huge building and to bring in clients. And your father does a fantastic job. He brings in a lot of blue chip clients, and this Merchandise Mart becomes a huge cash cow for the Kennedy family. At the same time, your father also becomes chairman of the Chicago Board of Education. So he was already developing, apparently, a real interest in young people and education. 1952, your uncle, John F. Kennedy, he had already been elected to Congress. He runs for the Senate in Massachusetts. Your father comes east to help and provide significant help in that campaign, which is something of an upset win. 1953, your parents are married. I believe he said it was 1,700 people filled St. Patrick's Cathedral, an 8-tier wedding cake. It was a big deal. 1956, the Democratic National Convention comes to Chicago, and of course, John Kennedy nearly becomes the vice presidential nominee, and probably to his benefit, he does not, but he decides to run for president 4 years hence. And again, your father becomes very involved in that campaign, particularly out west. I mean, his contributions were significant. And in Illinois, where he is very, very popular, and Illinois was a critical state in that campaign. Kennedy is elected president, and one of the first orders of business is he had talked at the end of the campaign about establishing this thing called a Peace Corps, but no one really knew what that was, and he assigns that to your father, that task. Basically, your father has 6 weeks to build a program from scratch and try and get it through Congress, which was no easy task. Can you talk a little bit about that process and what you know of it?
Well, obviously, it happened before I was born. I was born in '64. We're obviously talking early '61. But President Kennedy, then Senator Kennedy, made that request or plea, if you will, to America's young people at the University of Michigan late at night. And the idea caught on fire and grew. And Senator Kennedy's campaign got hundreds and thousands of letters of young people wanting to join the Peace Corps. And the joke was that he gave the task to Dad because he thought it was going to be a failure. And if it was a failure, it would be easier to fire a relative than it would be to fire a political friend. But obviously, it's not a failure. It's a huge success. And he creates it, as you said, out of scratch. Definitely built on his experience in the Experiment for International Living, which you referenced a while ago when he was in high school and in college, traveling through Italy and Germany and learning about what was going on with Mussolini and Hitler at that point. And he just believed in, I think, the Christian idea of conversation, of interacting with your fellow human beings, of spending time together, but also trying to help each other. And I think ultimately that's what the Peace Corps is. It's about really getting people to bond and to work together on simple tasks or complex tasks. And that's what he was so proud of, Peace Corps volunteers. And you see that throughout his career, whether it's later on the Johnson administration, starting in 1964 with the call to create the Great Society, creating programs like Head Start, Legal Services for the Poor, Job Corps. These are all efforts of people hand to hand working with each other, trying to make the world a little bit better. And that's what really characterized his career and his work with my mom as well.
One of the key features of the Peace Corps and your father's approach to it, I think, really, his personal approach was that it was not bureaucratic. And we will see that in his throughout his career, that he really hated sort of stilted bureaucracies. To some degree, I think President Kennedy did as well, but your father particularly felt that way. I have a quote from the book. In retrospect, Shriver's lack of bureaucratic knowledge may have been one of his greatest assets in starting the Peace Corps. It meant, for one thing, he didn't know what couldn't be done. The Peace Corps, under Shriver's direction, never lost the anything is possible creative anarchy, a mixture of idealism, naivete, and brilliance that had characterized it from the beginning. The early Peace Corps didn't cut red tape as much as shred it. Shriver at one point says, "You guys had a good day today. You broke 14 laws." So.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, at that quote, I don't know who said it. You know, there is brilliance in there. Dad knew and understood around him of being idealistic. But it, you know, as he often said, it depends on what ideals you subscribe to. Being idealistic does not mean you're naive. I mean, you know, he put himself on a scholarship through Yale Law School, which was at that point, and probably still is today, the best law school in the country. And, you know, he's very sharp, very smart, very hardworking. You know, obviously forged a great partnership with Vice President Johnson. Johnson gave him the role of creating the war on poverty out of nothing, and gave him 5 weeks to pull it together, and came up with ideas like Head Start, Legal Services for the Poor, Job Corps, Vista, foster grandparents. I mean, there's a really smart, hardworking, shrewd political operator here as well. And that's what the book, we called it A War, is about. It's his recollection of the war on poverty and how he created it. You got to remember, in 1964, the Democratic Party is running Congress. It is a conservative party that is not open to full civil rights. A lot of conservative Southern Democrats opposed to it, and Dad somehow got through. Again, Head Start, which was giving, you know, young Black kids in Mississippi and Alabama a head start so they could go to college in schools that were segregated. I mean, let's think about that for a second. I mean, that's real political acumen, and he did it in a bipartisan manner with mayors who were Republicans all across the country, Democrats who are very conservative and segregationists, as well as Republicans that are, you know, more moderate to liberal. So that quote's good, but it don't undersell how smart and tough he was.
To go back for a moment for the Peace Corps, there was a moment when it looked like the Peace Corps would not pass through Congress. And your father turns to Lyndon Johnson, who was vice president at the time, both for advice, because Johnson was such a master legislative technician, and also asking Johnson as a last-ditch effort to talk to the President, Kennedy, in support of the Peace Corps, because it looked like it was going to be folded into the State Department, which would have made it really a completely different kind of organization. And a bond forms between Johnson and your father, a real mutual respect, I think, which puts your father in a difficult position, as we should talk about over the years, between what was called then the Kennedy camp and sort of the Johnson camp, because your father really was about serving people, and perhaps more than the political considerations of either party, Johnson or Kennedy, by that I mean. And but it was a very difficult position. There were a number of times in your father's life that he was interested in running for office and probably would have been successful, particularly earlier on. They talked about him being either governor or senator from Illinois. In 1964, there was a very real possibility that Johnson would have liked to have named your father as his vice presidential running mate, and the Kennedys did not want that. Robert Kennedy in particular. But I wanted to ask you, because in the book it comes up frequently, and it came up a number of times, I think, in your father's life and career, where he was torn a little bit between his loyalty, obviously, to the family he married into and respected, and a President Johnson who he also respected and wanted to serve. Can you talk about that and about how he handled that?
I think my father and mother went to Mass every day, and my father asked for guidance and support, and it was a devout Catholic. I mean, his family was a serious Catholic family from Baltimore, from Western Maryland, and he had a deep faith in God. And as I said, went to Mass every day. And I think that was really what was the animating part of his life, was the call. Some people obviously use the term Catholic social justice, that teaching about feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, sheltering the homeless, visiting those in prison. And my father never said to me that he was, angry at Uncle Bobby or Uncle Teddy or Uncle Jack, or missed out on an opportunity to be governor of Illinois or governor of Maryland because of, some Kennedy machine or some, language like that. Never, not once. If he wanted to run for office and he thought about it, obviously he ran twice, once with George McGovern in '72, once in '76 by himself for president. It didn't work out. Never heard him complain about that either. I just think that, every day was an opportunity to try to make the world a little bit better. Every day he went to Mass and asked for guidance and for support in his relationship with God. And he worked with my mom on that every day. And it kind of sounds corny, but that's the way he was. I don't ever recall him complaining about being shortchanged by my mother or her family, ever. It's preposterous, frankly, in my experience with him.
Obviously,
he just got up and went.
Let me talk about your mother for a minute before we move on. She had some interests of her own and tremendous energy, as I said, and intelligence and drive, and she was described as the most astute politician in the family. But her interests initially were in juvenile delinquency and also in what was then called the mentally retarded, now intellectual disabilities. And she began something at your home in Maryland, a large estate you had there called Camp Shriver, where she would invite up to 100 children in during the summer, to children with intellectual disabilities of various sorts, to get a different kind of experience than that they had had. The book describes it as, your brother Bobby is quoted as saying it was utter chaos, but maybe it was a happy chaos. But there were some children who, for example, had to wear helmets because they would bang their heads on trees, and they're running around. And then inside your house, the Peace Corps, the War on Poverty was being planned at the kitchen table, and there were dogs and horses and probably cats running around. And what do you remember of that? Those growing up years?
Remember, growing up, I remember Camp Shriver. My mother reinstituted it as she was much older, having people with developmental differences over to the house to and her home after Timberlawn, which was a farm that they rented for 25 to 30 years in Maryland. And my mother believed that people with developmental disabilities had a lack of opportunity, and she wanted to create a camp and a program where they were given the chance to participate on playing fields, whether it was softball, whether it was volleyball, whether it was swimming. And that was the genesis for the Special Olympics program, which got started officially, in Chicago in 1968. So it was chaotic, but that's fine. They believed in bringing people together, trying new ideas, moving forward. Again, think about it, 1964, 65 people with developmental disabilities are locked up. They're not talked about. They're in institutions. They're forgotten. And, my mom pushed her family to have a big article in the Saturday Evening Post about their sister Rosemary, who was developmentally disabled. And once the Kennedy family, married, it changed it for so many people across this country and really across the world. And you see that with Special Olympics today. It's a powerful movement, knocking down walls of misunderstanding and prejudice against people with developmental disabilities through the power of sports. Super proud of what my mom did, and she had a great partner, my dad.
And your brother Tim is, I believe, the director today, still of the Special Olympics.
He's the chairman of the board. He was the CEO for a number of years. Done a great job on that front too.
Go back now to 1964. Lyndon Johnson has been elected by a huge margin over Barry Goldwater and has a mandate, and he wants to start a war on poverty as part of the Great Society. And he taps your father for this position, even though your father is still heavily involved with the Peace Corps. We do have a tape we're going to try and run. This is LBJ calling your father either on a Friday afternoon or Saturday to tell him that he's about to announce your father's appointment. Let me see if we have that.
Mark. Good morning, Mr. President. How are you? I'm going to announce your appointment at press conference. What press conference? This afternoon. Well, God, I think it would be advisable, if you don't mind, if I could have this weekend, I wanted to sit down with a couple of people and see what we could get in the way of some sort of a plan, because what happens, at least my thought is, that what happens is that you announce somebody or hear somebody else, and they don't know what the hell they're doing or what the program's going to be specifically, and who's going to carry it. Then you're in a hell of a hole, because they all start calling you up and saying, well, now, what are you going to do? Well, carry this out and all that. And you just don't talk to them. Just go away and go to Camp David. Figure it out. We need something to say to the press. We've got to say to them, and I've got to tell them what I talked to you about yesterday. And you can just take off, work out your Peace Corps any way you want to. You can be head of the committee and have some acting operator. If you want Bill to help you, I'll let him do that. I'll do anything, but I want to announce this and get it behind me, so I quit getting all these other pressures. And I think you've got to do it. You just can't let me down. So the quicker we get it behind us, the better. And you can talk to them as special assistant to the president a hell of a lot easier, and you can talk to them just as peace administrator. And if they want to talk to you, you can tell them. Speak for me. Yes. Well, Mr. President. But don't make me wait till next week, because I want to satisfy this press with something. I told them we're going to have a press meeting. Well, let me say this. They're going to have all these damn questions, and I don't want to be indecisive about them. If you can't run a $100 million program in your left hand and $1 billion with your right hand, you're not as smart as I think you are. Besides, the money's got, that's no problem at all. It's the people that I'm in. Well, the people... I want to keep all these people for the government that are in the Peace Corps and bring them into any other program so that they...
Well, that's good. I'm not going to sever you from the Peace Corps at all. I'm going to say that you're going to maintain your identification with the Peace Corps. And how much of the details you do, whether you hire them or sweep out the room, is going to be a matter for you to determine. And I'm going to make that clear. But I am going to make it clear that you're Mr. Poverty. And at home and abroad, you ought to be. And I don't care who you have run the Peace Corps. If you can run it, wonderful. If you can't, get Oshkosh from Chicago, and I'll name it.
I can't get anybody. The only guy that could possibly do it, Mr. President, is Bill.
Well, you can write your ticket. You can write your ticket on anything you want to do there. I want to get rid of poverty, though.
Yeah.
And you can organize the poverty right from the beginning. And you'll have to get on the message Monday. But the Sunday paper is going to say it's you, Mr. Poverty, unless you've got real compelling reasons, which I haven't heard. And I'm going to say that you're going to maintain your identification with the Peace Corps and operate it to such an extent as you may think desirable.
Well, thank you. We're back. I hope you had a chance to hear that. What are your thoughts? Well, I know you probably heard that before.
That's pretty good, right?
What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I've heard it. Yeah, I mean, it's crazy to think that a president would actually say that he wants to get rid of poverty. Isn't that wonderful? Yeah. I mean, there's quotes in, other excerpts I've heard of Dad, when they've asked him, do you really think, Mr. Shriver, you can get rid of poverty? And he said, yes, I do. And if you think about it just for a minute, and your viewers think about it, I mean, what if we actually did eradicate poverty? I mean, would that be the greatest war victory ever? I mean, just think about that. Instead of trying to blow the hell out of everybody and, use might is right, if you actually tried to educate Americans, young and old, if you tried to actually invest in our country, and invest in peace across the world, that'd be the greatest victory ever. I love that line. He said, I want you to be Mr. Poverty. I mean, imagine if we had a leadership in this country that was trying to pull together Republicans and Democrats to really eradicate poverty. It'd be crazy. It'd be beautiful.
I think that, personalities, just even with policy, personalities are important. I think we saw there an example of LBJ's personality. They called that the Johnson treatment. It was pretty much impossible for anyone to resist it for very long. Your father made a valiant effort, but he went into the.
I don't think Dad was trying to resist it. I think he's created a brand new program. He's at it for 3 years in the Peace Corps. His brother-in-law, President Kennedy, has died 6 weeks earlier. And he's just coming back from a trip. His wife is pregnant with her 4th child, who's due any day, being me. That phone call's in January, beginning of February, and I am born 2 weeks later. Brother-in-law was dead 6 weeks ago, and he organized the funeral. That's a lot to throw at somebody in a 5-week period, not to mention Christmas. Yeah. And Dad went into that thing eyes wide open, put together a hell of a team. And that's what the book We Called It a War is about. It's about how he built a bipartisan coalition of Republicans and Democrats, big city mayors who are Republicans, who are supporting the war on poverty, as well as Democrats who are segregationists. And, he's a smart, shrewd political operator, and so is the president. And that's why the president gave it to him. You don't have a guy that's given a huge opportunity to create the Peace Corps, and then 3.5 years later to create the war on poverty if you're not smart and skilled. And that's what he was. And that's what We Called It a War is about. And it's a great read.
He was smart, skilled, and he was likable. And I think you mentioned earlier that he was able to talk to both sort of Southern racist Democrats at the time, certainly racist at that time, many of the Southern Democrats, and Northern liberals and everyone in between, and everybody seemed to like him. And I think that there was something about his personality that someone else in that job might have been just as intelligent and just as driven, but without that personality that your father had, it might have been even more difficult, if not impossible.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, nowadays it's called emotional intelligence. And I think he had it, again, there's no ego here. My father didn't complain about not being able to run for governor or president. He didn't complain about some Kennedy machine or however you want to characterize it. What he really was interested in was trying to spread peace and trying to make the world a little bit better. It's corny, but it's true. And that's what he did with my mom. And, starting the Special Olympics in 1968, when my father's the ambassador to France, and he's letting his wife, and I use the term letting on purpose, because at that point in time, if you're an ambassador to France, which is one of the 2 or 3 biggest posts in in the State Department, and they're running around playing sports in the French embassy with people with developmental disabilities, and it's done by a woman. I mean, that's pretty crazy. And, so he had a confidence not only in his wife, but he had confidence that she was doing the right thing. And he was trying to do the right thing. He didn't get his ego in the way. So I think people respected that. So yes, it's called emotional intelligence now. He had a lot of it.
He had it
A
in
lot of it.
spades. Yep. But I mentioned that a lot of younger and even middle-aged people now don't know what he accomplished, but they may know about many of these services that have become part of our lives that were there because of him. And I just want to, all of these were included in the poverty bill that he managed to get passed. Job Corps, Neighborhood Youth Corps, Upward Bound, Vista, Head Start, Legal Services for the Poor, Community Health Centers, and something called Community Action. Of those, some of them have gone to some degree by the wayside, but Vista, Head Start, Legal Services for the Poor, Community Health Centers are still tremendously important in this country. And again, arguably would not have been there if some or all of them had he not been the tireless advocate that he was.
They're all around. They've been, labeled different things by President Clinton, created AmeriCorps, President Bush added on to it, but it's the same idea, and he started it. It's VISTA, Volunteers in Service Towards America, is now known as AmeriCorps. Community action agencies are providing Head Start services. They're providing services to families all across cities and rural areas across this country. Neighborhood health centers are all across the country. These are all efforts to try to empower people to make a difference in their own lives. It's not a top-down from Washington decree here, which is often, what they're accused of. But community action agencies are communities coming together and figuring out what they need in order to address poverty in their communities. And the reason you got pushback on a lot of this is because poor people, when they organized, started asking for and demanding services and investments, and politicians didn't want to give it to them because they wanted to control the money. So that's why they got a lot of pushback during the war on poverty, is because politicians didn't want to be told by poor people how to invest in their community.
That is the segment that Lyndon Johnson, being the politician that he was, sort of foresaw from the beginning. He was a little bit concerned about that, but again, these are here now, and are not. They're going to be with us for a very long time. 1968, of course, your uncle is assassinated. 1972. George McGovern runs and gets the nomination of the Democratic Party because Senator Ted Kennedy has decided not to run. And McGovern chooses Thomas Eagleton with almost no vetting. Turns out Eagleton has some serious mental history background and has to step down. Then McGovern reaches out to 6 more potential vice presidential nominees before turning to your father, and your father accepts, not because he thinks that there's a chance of winning, because it looked like there was no chance of winning, but he did. Why did he accept at that point?
I think it's he's from the generation that's serving the country, not having the country serve them. It's the generation of volunteering to fight in World War II. It's, President H.W. Bush volunteering in the military. It's a commitment to the country. It's not going into politics in order to make money and make a lot of it. And if George McGovern asked him, he called it the Lucky Seven. He was the 7th pick. There were 7 members of our family. I have, 4 brothers and sisters. I'm 5. My dad made 7. and he had a little motorboat, and he called it the Lucky Set after the program that my father started in the war on poverty. So, he was proud of these things. And again, defeat is in politics, and President Clinton said at his dad's funeral that there's, losing in politics is a brutal thing, but it's being forgotten that's even more painful for a politician. That was never true with my father. He didn't care about that. It's just an opportunity to try to do something better the next day. So this idea that, people would forget him, I guarantee you, I paid, Peace Corps volunteer that he would have been, making $1 million. It was the fact that people were out there volunteering to make this country, make this world a better place that he really loved. So joining George McGovern's ticket and losing, no big deal. If you wake up the next day after the election, go to work in January of '73, try to make a difference. So, he just didn't think that way.
There were many at the time, and he did a fantastic job as vice presidential candidate. There were many who felt that if it had been reversed, if he had been the presidential nominee at that in 1972, that they might still have lost, but it would have been a lot closer. He was a terrific candidate that year. 76 was. Go ahead.
He had huge admiration for McGovern. Strong admiration. Senator McGovern came to my dad's wake, spoke at it. There's been a number of wonderful books about George McGovern volunteering as a young man to fly planes over Germany and Italy, bombed. There's a guy with a lot of guts. You don't have to agree with him politically, but had a great career, never a scandal involved in his life, and did more for others than many, many people have ever hoped to do. My father had great admiration for him.
1976, of course.
By the way,
yeah.
I look for a second at the people that they ran against. Richard Nixon and Spiro Agnew, who was the former governor of Maryland. Both of them resigned. Both of them, were terrible leaders and did more to damage the country. And the losers in that race were McGovern and Shriver. Neither one of them ever had a scandal associated with them, and they lost the race. Big deal. Rather have your honor and your commitment to doing the good than having to be forced out and resigning.
So I wanted to, as we near the end, I wanted to talk about your father, of course, ran for president in 1976, and that didn't work out as he might have hoped. But in the later years, he continued to be very active. He was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. I can't recall which year it was that he actually received that diagnosis, but you were very involved in his care, and you've written an absolutely poignant and lovely book called A Good Man about those years and about his life. Can you talk a little bit about what that was like?
Strips away the person who has it, their memory, and it's particularly hard on the caregivers, and it disproportionately impacts women. More women get Alzheimer's than men, and more women are caregivers for Alzheimer's patients than men. And it is bankrupting the country. And we've got to do more investment in trying to find a cure for Alzheimer's, not cut back investments in medical research, which is what we're doing, which is foolish. And we ought to be investing in trying to find a cure for Alzheimer's. It's brutal. And my father struggled with it over a number of years. He struggled, but in one way, it was actually quite beautiful, and it stripped away and supportive and loving. He didn't, know my name. He didn't know his grandchildren's name. But more often than not, he was joyful to be around. I mean, he did have bouts of anger, and he, got disoriented, and that causes confusion and anger. But in many cases, he was great with his grandchildren. He was great with his children, including me. He had a series of moments where he would have insight. I remember going to a soccer game and yelling at my daughter to run faster. Lacrosse game, excuse me, it was a lacrosse game. And I was yelling, my dad was there in a wheelchair, and he turned to me, halfway through the game and said, "Did I yell at you like that when you were a kid?" And I thought about it, and I said, "No, you didn't," because he would come to all of our sporting events. He'd encourage us, but he didn't scream like I was screaming at our daughter. And he was teaching me, even though he had Alzheimer's, about how to be a good dad, how to be loving and supportive, rather than a maniac on the sidelines screaming at your kid, which unfortunately too many of us do, especially too many men, yelling at their kids and living vicariously through their children's accomplishment and putting pressure on them.
I want to bring up a story that many people may have heard, which is that there was a touch football game when you were kids playing with the Kennedy kids, and one of your brothers, I think, fell down and was hurt and crying a little bit, and it may have been Robert Kennedy that said, Kennedys don't cry, and your father picked his son up, your brother up, and said, well, we're Shrivers. Shrivers can cry, which is kind of sweet in a way. It goes along with what you were just saying and the kind of father he was.
Yeah, it's about, I guess, going back to the emotional intelligence. Crying and sadness is part of life, and you have to acknowledge all of those feelings. He didn't let us pout and, stay in that state for long periods of time, because you had to get up and go to work. You had to put a Band-Aid on your skinned knee, but it's okay to cry. And that's the point of that story. And it's also the point of, him teaching me about how to be a father who wasn't yelling and screaming at their kids, which is what I was doing. Even though he was battling Alzheimer's. So it's a powerful message, and he wrote letters every day, slip them under the door, mail them to you when you were in college. I have files of them still, and he's still teaching me how to be a better and a good man. I'm not a good man, as my daughters remind me and my son reminds me I'm an okay dad, but I'm trying, and I'm still using him as an example. And I think the book, Thank You, that I wrote, A Good Man, I hope will help other fathers and mothers. And I hope the book that we called it a war, his book that he wrote about the war on poverty, will interest your viewers as well.
One final thing. When he was, I think he was in his 80s, he went to China, and I can't remember what it was for, but it was some kind of quasi-official visit. And he's playing, maybe he was 80 years old, he's playing basketball with the Chinese kids. He takes off his jacket and he's, gets rid of the formalities and starts playing basketball, and gives a speech.
Olympic.
Go ahead.
It's for special. He goes over for Special Olympics, trying to work with my mom and brother, spreading Special Olympics into China and all across the world. Yes, and he's playing basketball with a Special Olympics athlete in China. Sorry, I cut you off.
So after Shriver's speech, I'm quoting from Strassel's book, everyone expected the Chinese official to get up and read some official standard proclamation, but to everyone's amazement, he departed from the official script. Standing up from his chair on the dais, he pointed to Sarge and said, look at this guy. He's 85 years old. He's not in great health, yet he got on an airplane from America yesterday to fly here. He's a rich and powerful and important American from the Kennedy family. He doesn't have to do any of this. He could just be sitting back in America enjoying himself. He doesn't have to be here. But he keeps doing this because working for retarded children is important. If we Chinese people have any pride in ourselves, we ought to match this kind of commitment to humanity. This man, who has every right to be sitting back in retirement, is putting himself through all this to come tell us that these people matter. We ought to treat these children with more respect.
Damn, that's a pretty good quote.
It is.
It's pretty good. It speaks for itself.
A great deal about him.
It's hard.
Yeah. What a great man. What a great mother you had. And thank you for the work you're doing still with children, as he did. And your siblings are all working in various ways to help all of us. So thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me. Have a great afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thank you to Mark Shriver. And please join us next time on Meet the Author.